My name is Leah Bennett. I'm 28 years old, and for most of my life, I was invisible. Not literally, of course, but in my family, I might as well have been a ghost floating through the rooms while everyone else celebrated my older brother, Marcus. He was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, the one whose name was spoken with pride while mine was barely whispered. Growing up in the shadow of someone who seemed to have it all, the grades, the charm, the career, felt like living in a story where I wasn't even a side character, just a footnote no one bothered to read. But let me tell you something. The moment everything changed wasn't when I proved them wrong. It was when I decided I didn't need their approval anymore. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, you're probably wondering how someone goes from being the family disappointment to running a company that turned heads and dropped jaws. Well, it all started with one sentence, one cruel laugh, and one aunt who thought she could define my future with her words. "You'll never be as successful as your brother," my Aunt Carol said, and she laughed like it was the funniest joke she'd ever told. That moment became the spark that lit a fire inside me, and what happened next is something I never could have imagined. If this story is hitting close to home, hit that subscribe button and drop a like. You're going to want to see how this unfolds. What I'm about to share with you isn't just about revenge or proving people wrong. It's about reclaiming your identity when everyone around you has already written your story and decided you're not worth the. It's about the silent battles we fight when no one's watching, the nights we cry alone, and the mornings we wake up and choose to keep going anyway. So buckle up, because this journey is messy, painful, beautiful, and ultimately liberating. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll see why that one sentence from Aunt Carol became the best thing that ever happened. It was a Sunday afternoon in late September, the kind of day where the sun filters through the curtains and makes everything look deceptively peaceful. We were all gathered at my parents' house for what was supposed to be a casual family dinner. But in the Bennett household, nothing was ever just casual. Marcus had just closed a major deal at his finance firm, and naturally, the entire conversation revolved around his latest achievement. My mom was beaming, my dad was nodding with that proud smile he reserved only for Marcus, and everyone else was hanging on every word like he was delivering a TED Talk. Meanwhile, I sat at the edge of the table, pushing mashed potatoes around my plate, feeling like a piece of furniture no one noticed. That's when Aunt Carol, my mom's older sister, and the family's unofficial judge of success, decided to twist the knife. She turned to me with that condescending smile she always wore, the one that made you feel small before she even opened her mouth. "So, Leah," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, "what are you up to these days? Still trying to figure things out?" The table went quiet, and I felt every pair of eyes land on me like spotlights exposing my inadequacy. Before I could answer, she laughed, this sharp, dismissive laugh that cut through the air like glass shattering. "You'll never be as successful as your brother," she said, waving her hand toward Marcus like he was a trophy on display. "Some people are just born with it, you know? And some people, well, they're not." The room stayed silent, and no one, not even my parents, came to my defense. They just nodded along, as if her words were an undeniable truth we all had to accept. I didn't respond. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't storm out like part of me wanted to. Instead, I smiled, nodded, and said, "You're probably right, Aunt Carol." But inside, something shifted. That sentence, as cruel and dismissive as it was, became a line in the sand. It was the moment I realized I had been living my entire life waiting for their validation, their approval, their permission to believe I was worthy. And in that silence, in that moment of complete humiliation, I made a decision. I was done waiting. Little did Aunt Carol know, her words weren't the end of my story. They were the beginning of something she never saw coming. Growing up, it felt like my entire identity was one long comparison chart, pinned to an invisible wall in my parents' heads. Marcus was the benchmark, the standard, the example they used for every conversation about success. "Marcus did this at your age," my dad would say. Or, "When Marcus was in college, he already knew what he wanted," my mom would add, as if repeating his name enough times would magically fix whatever was wrong with. Every report card, every job, every decision I made was held up against his, and somehow, I always came up short. Before I continue, make sure you're subscribed and leave a like if you've ever felt like you were living in someone else's shadow, because what comes next will probably feel way too familiar. It wasn't just my parents either. Family friends, neighbors, even distant relatives who barely knew me would ask how Marcus was doing before they remembered I existed. At family gatherings, people would crowd around him, asking about his career, his promotions, his big city life, while I stood on the sidelines, balancing paper plates and pretending I was fine. If I mentioned something I was working on, It was met with polite nods and quick subject changes, like they were indulging a child who insisted on talking about imaginary friends. After a while, I stopped volunteering information altogether. The less I said, the less they could dismiss. What hurt the most wasn't that they admired Marcus. It was that their admiration for him seemed to erase any chance of seeing value in. I felt like a blurry photocopy of the real child, the one they were proud of, the one whose achievements gave them something to brag about. That kind of constant comparison doesn't just bruise your ego, it slowly eats away at your sense of self. I started to believe that maybe they were right, that maybe I really was the one who just didn't have it. But deep down, under all that doubt and resentment, there was this quiet, stubborn voice whispering that there had to be more to my story than just being the lesser Bennett. That whisper, as small as it was, would become the thread I started to follow. The thing about being compared your whole life is that at some point you stop asking, who am I? And you start asking, what's wrong with me? By the time I hit my mid-20s, I wasn't Leah anymore. I was Marcus's sister, the one who hadn't figured it out yet. The one they talked about with sighs and worried glances. At family dinners, my accomplishments, however small, were treated like consolation prizes. Marcus closed on a condo? Amazing. I finished a certification course? That's nice, honey. If this is sounding a little too real to you, hit that subscribe button and leave a like, because you are not alone in that. And what I did next might give you a different way to look at your own story. I remember one evening in particular, standing in the kitchen while my mom and Aunt Carol talked in the next room, thinking I couldn't hear them. My mom sighed and said, I just wish Leah would find something she's good at. Marcus always had a plan. Aunt Carol replied, some people just aren't built for success the same way. She's more sensitive. The way she said sensitive made it sound like a defect, like a crack in the foundation. I stood there gripping the edge of the counter, my nails digging into the wood, my chest tight. They weren't trying to be cruel. That almost made it worse. They genuinely believed they were stating facts. Moments like that don't just sting. They stack, one on top of the other, day after day, year after year, until you start to disappear behind them. I stopped sharing my ideas, my interests, even my dreams, because every time I did, I felt them weigh it on this invisible scale against Marcus, and his side of the scale always dropped heavier. But even as they erased me with their comparisons, I started to realize something important. If I kept letting them define me, I would never get the chance to find out who I actually was. That realization didn't come with a lightning bolt or a dramatic outburst. It came slowly, like waking up from a long sleep. And that quiet awakening is what pushed me toward the decision that changed everything. If there was one person in my family who took joy in reminding me of my place, it was Aunt Carol. She wasn't just critical. She was precise, surgical even, in the way she delivered her judgment. Every comment was wrapped in a smile, every insult disguised as concern, and somehow that made it worse. I'm just being honest, sweetie, she'd say after telling me I lacked direction or ambition. Someone has to tell you the truth. But her version of truth always felt like a weapon, sharpened specifically to cut me down. While everyone else in the family might have been quietly disappointed, Aunt Carol made sure I knew it, loudly and often. She had this way of timing her remarks perfectly, always catching me when I was already vulnerable. At Marcus's engagement party, she pulled me aside and said, it must be hard watching everyone else move forward while you're still exploring. At Thanksgiving, she'd ask what I was doing for work, and before I could finish explaining, she'd interrupt with, well, at least you're trying. That laugh of hers, sharp, dismissive, condescending, became the soundtrack to my failures. It wasn't just that she doubted me, it was that she enjoyed doubting me. Her words weren't just observations, they were predictions, and she delivered them like prophecies she was certain would come true. What made Aunt Carol's cruelty particularly painful was that no one ever called her out on it. My parents would laugh nervously and change the subject. Marcus would shrug it off, completely oblivious to how her words landed on me. Even when I tried to defend myself once, telling her that I was working on something meaningful, she just patted my shoulder and said, of course you are, honey. I'm sure it'll work out. Somehow. That somehow hung in the air like a question mark over my entire existence. But here's the thing about people like Aunt Carol. They underestimate you so completely that they never see you coming. And that overconfidence, that would become her biggest mistake. There comes a point in every person's life where you hit a wall so hard that you either crumble or you pivot. For me, that moment came on a Tuesday night in November, sitting alone in my tiny apartment with the lights off and my phone buzzing with family group chat messages celebrating Marcus's latest promotion. I stared at the screen, reading message after message. So proud. You're incredible. What an achievement. and I felt this hollow ache in my chest that I'd carried for so long, I'd almost forgotten it was there. But that night, it wasn't just sadness, it was something sharper, something that felt almost like clarity. I realized I had been living inside a story someone else wrote about me, a narrative where I was the underachiever, the lost one, the sister who would never measure up. And the worst part? I had accepted it. I had internalized every dismissive comment, every comparison, every laugh from Aunt Carol, and I had let them define the limits of what I believed I could do. That night, sitting in the dark, I asked myself a question I'd been too afraid to ask before. What if they're wrong? Not just a little wrong, but completely, fundamentally wrong about who I am and what I'm capable of? That question cracked something open inside me, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. The decision didn't come with fireworks or a dramatic declaration. It was quiet, almost mundane. I opened my laptop, pulled up a notebook I'd been keeping for months, full of ideas, sketches, plans I told myself were too ambitious, too risky, too far beyond my reach, and I started to work. Not to prove anyone wrong, not to shove success in Aunt Carol's face, but because I needed to prove something to myself. I needed to know if the voice inside me, the one that had been whispering, "There's more," for years, was telling the truth. That night, I planted the seed of what would eventually become my company. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't ask for permission. I just started. And that quiet beginning, hidden from the eyes of my family, would become the foundation of everything that followed. While my family assumed I was still figuring things out, I was actually building something in secret. Every night after work, every weekend, every spare moment I had, I poured into this project like my life depended on it. Because in a way, it did. I was developing a sustainable tech product, something I'd been passionate about for years, but never had the courage to pursue. The idea had started small, just a concept scribbled in notebooks, but now it was real. I was researching, prototyping, reaching out to manufacturers, teaching myself everything I didn't know. It was exhausting, terrifying, and exhilarating all at once. If you're working on something right now that no one believes in yet, hit that subscribe button and drop a like, because I need you to hear what happened when I refused to give up on myself. The hardest part wasn't the work itself, it was the silence. I couldn't tell my family because I knew exactly what would happen. My mom would worry, my dad would lecture me about stability, and Aunt Carol would laugh and say something like, "Oh, Leah's trying to start a business now? How cute." I couldn't risk their doubt seeping into the fragile confidence I was building, so I kept it hidden, which meant I had no one to celebrate the small wins with, no one to encourage me when things got hard, no one to remind me why I started. There were nights I sat at my kitchen table at 2 a.m, staring at spreadsheets and prototypes, wondering if I was delusional. Maybe they were right. Maybe I didn't have what it took. But then I'd remember that dinner, that laugh, that sentence, "You'll never be as successful as your brother." And something in me would harden, would refuse to let that be the ending of my story. I wasn't doing this out of spite, not entirely, anyway. I was doing it because I finally understood that my worth wasn't something they could grant or take away. It was something I had to claim for myself. So I kept going, one late night at a time, one small breakthrough at a time, building something that felt like mine in a way nothing ever had before. And the more I built, the more I realized I wasn't just creating a company. I was creating a version of myself I'd never been allowed to become. Even as I made progress, doubt was my constant companion. Every time something went wrong, a supplier fell through, a design didn't work, a pitch got rejected, I heard Aunt Carol's voice in my head like a ghost I couldn't exorcise. "You'll never be as successful as your brother." It played on repeat, especially in the moments when I was most vulnerable, most exhausted, most ready to quit. There were days I questioned everything, my intelligence, my skills, my right to even try. Marcus made everything look effortless, like success was just his natural state. Meanwhile, I was clawing my way forward, stumbling over every obstacle, wondering if I was just proving them right. One particular low point came about 6 months into the project when a potential investor looked at my prototype, nodded politely, and said, "It's interesting, but I don't think it's ready yet. Maybe come back when you've got more experience." I smiled, thanked him, and walked out of that office feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. On the train ride home, I stared out the window and let myself imagine what it would feel like to just stop, to go back to my safe, unremarkable life where no one expected anything from me and I never had to risk failing publicly. It would be so much easier to prove them right than to keep fighting to prove them wrong. But here's the thing about doubt. It only wins if you let it make your decision. I didn't get off that train and quit. I got off that train, went home, and worked until 3 a.m. fixing the issues the investor pointed out. Not because I was fearless, I was terrified, but because I realized that if I gave up now, I'd spend the rest of my life wondering what could have been. I'd become the cautionary tale Aunt Carol always thought I was, the one who tried and failed and confirmed everyone's low expectations, and I refused to give her that satisfaction. So I kept going, even when doubt whispered louder than hope, because sometimes survival isn't about believing you'll succeed. It's about refusing to let them be right about you. The first real sign that my dream had a pulse came on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon. I had just finished a rough version of my product, a compact smart home device that helped people track and cut their energy usage in a simple, intuitive way. It wasn't perfect. The casing was a little uneven, the app interface was clunky, and the branding was basically just my name on a plain label. But it worked. I remember standing in my living room, watching the tiny screen light up and respond exactly the way I designed it to. And for a second, I forgot to breathe. This wasn't just an idea anymore. It was real. It was in my hands, and it was mine. My first client came almost by accident. A friend from college, Sarah, had seen a vague post I made in a small entrepreneur forum and messaged me, asking what I was working on. I hesitated before telling her I was still afraid of sounding ridiculous, but I finally sent her a demo video. A day later, she replied, "Leah, this is actually amazing. Can I buy one for my apartment?" That one message felt bigger than any compliment I'd ever gotten from my family. Someone who didn't owe me anything, who wasn't related to me, saw value in something I created. When I delivered the device to her and watched her face light up as she tested it, I felt a warmth in my chest I'd never felt before. It wasn't pride in the way my parents felt pride for Marcus. It was something deeper, quieter, but stronger. That first sale didn't make me rich. It didn't change my bank account in any dramatic way, but it changed everything inside me. For the first time, I saw a version of myself that wasn't defined by failure or comparison. I wasn't just Marcus's sister in that moment. I was Leah, the founder of something new, something useful, something that mattered to at least one person. It was like watching a small flame flicker to life in a room that had always been dark. And as small as that flame was, I knew one thing for certain. If I protected it, if I fed it, if I refused to let anyone blow it out, it could grow into something much bigger than anyone in my family ever imagined for me. As my product slowly improved and word quietly began to spread, I made a deliberate choice. I wasn't going to tell my family anything, not yet. Every instinct I had told me to protect this fragile new part of my life from the voices that had always torn me down. So while my parents thought I was just doing some freelance work and keeping busy, I was registering a business name, building a website, and shipping out small batches of devices to early users. Orders trickled in at first, then started coming a little faster, then a little faster after that. Each notification felt like another brick in the foundation of the life I was building, one they knew nothing about. Before I go on, make sure you're subscribed and leave a like if you've ever had to grow in silence just to protect your peace, because what happened next was the turning point I never saw coming. Keeping it secret wasn't easy. There were so many times I wanted to blurt it out at dinner, to drop the news that I had actual customer, real reviews, even a small waiting list. When my dad complained about how some people just don't have drive, I wanted to slam my laptop on the table and show him the spreadsheets, the emails, the late-night progress. But I knew better. I knew that if I opened that door too soon, the criticism would start, the doubts would flood in, and all the confidence I was carefully building would get washed away. So I smiled, nodded, and kept my mouth shut. I let them believe I was drifting, even as I was digging my heels into the ground and planting something solid. There's a special kind of strength that comes from growing in the dark, from evolving in a space no one else can see. It's lonely, yes, and sometimes painfully isolating, but it also means that every inch of progress belongs to you. No one can claim credit, no one can water it with their approval or poison it with their doubt. Those months of silent growth taught me that I didn't need an audience to become who I was meant to be. I just needed discipline, vision, and the courage to keep going without applause. What I didn't know then was that the silence I had chosen would make the eventual noise of my success that much louder. And when my family finally heard it, there would be no way to ignore me anymore. The official launch happened on a Saturday morning in early April. Almost a year and a half after that first night, I decided to stop living in someone else's story. I had spent weeks preparing, perfecting the final design, building a sleek website, reaching out to eco-conscious bloggers and small influencers who aligned with my mission. I woke up that morning with my stomach in knots, hit the publish button on my product page, and then just waited. For the first hour, nothing happened. I refreshed the page obsessively, checked my email every 30 seconds, paced around my apartment like a caged animal. Maybe this was it. Maybe I'd built something no one actually wanted. Then, around noon, the first order came in. then another, then 5 more within 20 minutes. By evening, my phone was buzzing nonstop with order notifications, messages from people asking questions, comments from users tagging friends. A small sustainability blog had featured my product in a roundup post, and it had started spreading. People weren't just buying it, they were talking about it, sharing it, posting photos of it in their homes. I sat on my couch watching the numbers climb, tears streaming down my face, my hands shaking. This wasn't just success in the traditional sense, this was proof. Proof that I wasn't broken, wasn't less than, wasn't the failure my family had quietly accepted I would be. Within 72 hours, I had sold out my first production run and had a waiting list of over 300 people. By the end of the week, I was being contacted by a regional retailer interested in carrying my product. My inbox was flooded with messages from customers saying how much they loved it, how it was making a difference in their lives, how they couldn't wait to tell their friends. I hadn't just launched a product. I had launched a version of myself that had been buried for so long, I'd almost forgotten she existed. And as overwhelming as it was, as terrifying and surreal and exhausting, I felt something I'd never felt before. I felt free. Free from their voices, their doubts, their definitions of who I should be. For the first time in my life, I was just me. About 2 months after the launch, Marcus called me out of the blue. That alone was unusual. We weren't close, and our conversations were usually limited to polite small talk at family dinners. "Hey, Leah," he said, his tone casual but curious. "Mom mentioned you've been really busy lately. What's going on?" I kept it vague, told him I was working on a project, didn't offer details. A week later, he texted me asking if we could meet for coffee. Something about his tone felt different, less dismissive, more genuinely interested. So I agreed, though part of me wondered if this was some kind of setup, another opportunity for my family to remind me of my place. We met at a cafe near his office, and after the usual pleasantries, he leaned forward and said, "So, I looked you up online? Your company is everywhere right now. People are talking about it in some of the business groups I'm in." I watched his face carefully, waiting for the condescension, the big brother lecture, the subtle reminder that he was still ahead. But it didn't come. Instead, he said, "Can I see it? Your office, your setup? Whatever you're working with?" I hesitated, then agreed. A few days later, he showed up at the small co-working space I'd recently rented, the one with my company logo on the door, shelves lined with inventory, a wall covered in press clippings and customer reviews. Marcus stood in the doorway for a long moment, just looking around. His expression was unreadable at first, then slowly shifted into something I'd never seen from him before. Genuine surprise. "Leah," he said quietly, This is really impressive." He walked over to the product display, picked up one of the devices, turned it over in his hand. "You built all of this yourself?" I nodded. "Yeah, just me." For the first time in our entire lives, I saw him look at me not as the little sister who couldn't keep up, but as someone who had done something he hadn't expected. "I had no idea," he said, shaking his head. And in that moment, I realized something powerful. His approval didn't matter anymore, but watching him finally see me, that felt like closure I didn't know I needed. Word spread fast in my family. Marcus must have told my parents, who told my mom's side of the family, and within days, everyone knew. The reactions were complicated. My parents called, their voices a strange mix of pride and confusion, like they couldn't reconcile the daughter they thought they knew with the one who had quietly built a successful business. "Why didn't you tell us?" my mom asked, her tone somewhere between hurt and impressed. I wanted to say, "Because you never believed I could," but instead I just said, "I wanted to make sure it was real first." They invited me to dinner the following weekend, and I knew exactly who would be there. The whole family, including Aunt Carol. Walking into that house felt different this time. I wasn't the invisible one anymore, the afterthought hovering at the edges of conversation. People actually looked at me when I entered the room. My dad shook my hand, like I was a business associate, not his daughter. My mom kept touching my arm, saying things like, "We always knew you had potential," which felt like revisionist history, but I let it slide. Marcus was there too, and for once, the spotlight wasn't entirely on him. Cousins asked me questions about the company, about how I got started, about what my plans were. It was surreal, like stepping into an alternate reality where I mattered. And then there was Aunt Carol. She stood near the kitchen counter, holding a glass of wine, her face frozen in this tight, polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. When our eyes met across the room, she didn't look away, but she didn't approach me either. No congratulations, no questions, no acknowledgement at all. Just silence. And honestly, that silence said more than any apology ever could. It told me she knew exactly what she had done, what she had said, and that she had been wrong. She didn't have the grace to admit it, but she couldn't deny it either. So she stood there, quiet and small, while everyone else celebrated something she had sworn would never happen. That silence, heavy and uncomfortable, was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. In the weeks that followed, I started to notice something shift inside me. The validation from my family, the praise, the newfound interest, the way they suddenly treated me like I mattered, felt good at first, but then it started to feel hollow. I realized I didn't need it anymore. For so long, I had been chasing their approval like it was oxygen, like I couldn't survive without it. But building my company in secret, growing without their eyes on me, had taught me something crucial. My worth wasn't contingent on their recognition. I had already proven to myself what I was capable of, and that was enough. I also realized that my success wasn't about beating Marcus or showing up Aunt Carol. Even though there was definitely a part of me that enjoyed watching them squirm, it was about reclaiming my identity from a script I never wrote. My whole life, I had been playing a role they assigned me, the struggling one, the uncertain one, the one who needed saving or fixing or endless patience. And I had internalized that role so deeply that I almost became it permanently. But when I stepped outside their narrative and started writing my own, I discovered a version of myself that was stronger, more capable, and more resilient than anyone, including me, had ever imagined. The real freedom didn't come from their applause. It came from the quiet moment when I stopped caring whether they clapped at all. I had built something meaningful, something that helped people, something that reflected my values and my vision. And whether my family saw it or not, whether Aunt Carol ever apologized or not, whether Marcus ever truly understood what I'd been through or not, none of that could take away what I had accomplished. I had broken free from the script, and in doing so, I had finally become the author of my own story. That realization was more powerful than any external validation could ever be. Looking back now, the moment I thought would feel like victory, the moment my family finally saw me, acknowledged me, respected me, didn't feel the way I imagined. I thought it would be this massive rush of satisfaction, this triumphant, I told you so moment where everything clicked into place and I felt whole again. But when it actually happened, when my parents were proud and Marcus was impressed, and even Aunt Carol was forced into uncomfortable silence, I felt oddly detached. Not disappointed exactly, but not fulfilled either. It was like I'd been climbing a mountain my entire life thinking the view from the top would change everything, only to realize the real transformation happened during the climb itself. The real victory wasn't proving them wrong. It was discovering who I was when I stopped trying to prove anything at all. It was those late nights in my apartment, working on designs no one knew about, believing in myself when no one else did. It was the moment I decided their opinion of me wasn't the truth, just a perspective I no longer had to accept. It was learning that my worth wasn't something they could grant or revoke. It was something that existed independent of their judgment. The company, the success, the recognition, those were incredible, and I'm grateful for them. But they were byproducts of something deeper, the choice to stop living in their story and start living in mine. I also learned that healing from years of comparison and dismissal doesn't happen overnight. Even after you succeed, there are still moments when I hear Aunt Carol's voice in my head, still days when I catch myself seeking validation I don't actually need. But now I recognize those moments for what they are, echoes of an old pattern, not a current reality. I've built a life where my value isn't measured against Marcus's achievements or defined by my family's approval. I've built a life where I get to decide what success looks like, where my voice matters, where my dreams are worth pursuing, and that, more than any profit margin or press mention, is the victory I'll carry with me forever. So here's what I want you to take away from all of this. If you're the one in your family who's been overlooked, underestimated, or constantly compared to someone else, I need you to hear this. Their narrative about you is not the truth. It's just the story they're telling because it's easier than seeing you clearly, because change is uncomfortable, because they've gotten used to putting you in a box that makes sense to them. But you don't have to stay in that box. You don't have to wait for permission to become who you're meant to be. You don't have to prove anything to anyone except yourself. Your journey might not look like mine. Maybe you're not starting a company. Maybe you're writing a book, changing careers, going back to school, healing from trauma, or simply choosing to stop shrinking yourself to make others comfortable. Whatever it is, do it quietly if you need to. Protect it fiercely. Don't let their doubts seep into the foundation you're building. And when the time comes, when you're ready, let your success speak louder than their criticism ever did. Not because you owe them a grand reveal, but because you owe yourself the chance to see what you're capable of when no one's holding you back. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt invisible in your own family or doubted your worth because of someone else's words, I want you to know you're not alone and you're not broken. You're just waiting for the moment when you decide to stop living their version of your life and start creating your own. So drop a comment and tell me, What's the one thing you're going to stop letting others define for you? What's the dream you've been too afraid to chase because someone told you it wasn't realistic? Share it below, because your story matters just as much as mine does. And if you want more stories like this, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell, because next time I'm sharing an even wilder journey about betrayal, resilience, and the moment everything I thought I knew got turned upside down. I'll see you in the next video.